All right, so we're going to start. We're on page 147 at the bottom of the page, and I have to do a quick halachic lesson before we start, otherwise this stuff won't make sense. I'm not guaranteeing it's going to make sense anyway, but it certainly won't make sense without this. And there's a number of halachic issues that are understood by the Talmud, and we have to understand them to really make sense of these arguments. So one is interesting. It's the difference between direct work and indirect work. So direct work is when you do something and there's an express purpose for it that you understand from the very beginning. And for example, you dig a hole. And the reason you're digging a hole is to lay a foundation for a building that you're about to build. And that would certainly be forbidden on Shabbat, right? Because you're not allowed to build on Shabbat. Everybody would agree. So you can't dig that hole on Shabbat. But there's also indirect work where you do it for altogether different reasons. And yet you come and you use that work for something later, even though you didn't mean that from the beginning, to do something that may be forbidden on Shabbat. It's like, your kid likes to play in the sand. I'm just actually grabbing these out of thin air, these examples out of thin air, but your kid likes to play in the sand, and he's going to dig and dig and dig, and what do you know? You got a hole. And after Shabbat, you decide, okay, I'm going to use that hole. That's going to be the foundation for my new house. So that's indirect work. So the indirect work, because it's play, and it's not done for that express purpose, actually is, well, let me just say there's a disagreement. And we're not going to go into what the law is, because the law actually is complicated, and this isn't a course on Jewish law, but I want you to understand the difference. Some rabbis would say, even indirect work, if it could lead to something that was direct, you're not allowed to do it. And some rabbis say that you are allowed to do indirect work. And of course, it's complicated because it gets into your psychology at that moment. Did he put the kid there to dig because he knew that eventually he wanted to have a foundation for his house, or was he just taking advantage of it, or like you could even play like you're playing around with golf. And so you're putting these tees in the ground, and it's a recreation on Shabbat. What could be wrong with it? And let's say you have an eruv, you've got every halachic safeguard, and you're playing golf, and you're putting in the tees, and you're practicing your putt. I don't play golf, so I don't know what you'd be doing, but you're practicing your driving, and then later you're a farmer, and you see when you made those tees, hey, those are going to be really good for planting. Well, you can't plant on Shabbat, but you can probably practice your golf swing. And what if in practicing your golf swing, you're actually doing some work that could be prohibited on Shabbat? So it's a distinction between indirect labor and direct labor, and there's a disagreement about whether or not it's permitted. And any questions about that? Yeah.
So in planting, the farmer would not come along until after Shabbat to do that.
Yes, no, clearly you can't be, right. But keep in mind, like, what does a farmer do? A farmer, makes those little holes,
yes, yeah.
And he puts the seeds in. So making those little holes is part of the work. It's clearly prohibited on Shabbat, but what if those holes show up for a different reason? Okay, that's the question. All right, now, putting out a candle on Shabbat, okay, and keep in mind this distinction between direct labor and indirect labor. So if you're putting out a lamp, a candle, let's say it's before electricity, all right, so it's kind of turning off a light. What's the direct purpose for extinguishing a light on Shabbat?
Save the candle. Additional usage.
Wrong. No, I mean, why? No, it's pretty clear. Why do you light something in the first place?
Right.
That's what candles are for, right? That's what lamps are for. That's what lights are for, so you can see. So why do you turn it off? So it's dark. Right. All right. Now there could be indirect purposes though. And one of those indirect purposes might be, like you said before, to save, because you're concerned about heating oil. You're concerned about the wick.
You don't have a lot of money.
Yeah, right. Now, you also get to another halachic category, which is hefsed merubah. Hefsed merubah is, under certain circumstances, you can overturn Jewish law if it's going to lead you to a great loss of money, a great financial loss. That's called hefsed merubah. It's also complicated. It's not a course in Jewish law. I'm just telling you that the principle exists. Okay, so, but here we're going to deal with both. I mean, the idea of financial loss, but also with the distinction between direct labor and indirect labor. If you feel like, gewalt, I need to save heating oil, so I'm putting out the candle. It's actually, you could interpret that as not being a direct labor.
Right.
The direct labor would be, it's dark. It's light. I need to go to sleep, so I'm going to turn out the light. Well, that's clearly not allowed. So right, everybody agrees that's not allowed. That's a direct labor. But if you have some other indirect reason for it, your mind isn't on light dark. Your mind is on saving the money or saving the candle. Maybe I'm just saying maybe that's allowed. That's the discussion. Okay. Any questions about that? All right. Let's go to it then. So we're on the last paragraph on page 147. Kichas al haner. All right. So there's a there's two opinions here, and it's quoting the Mishnah. Chas al haner means you're concerned about the lamp. Ner, which we have as candle. In those days, it was a generic word for any kind of light on Shabbat. So it would include all sorts of things. It would include oil, it would include a wick, it would include a lamp itself. Okay, and if you are putting out a light, not to put out the light, which would be the direct labor, but if you're putting out because you have financial concerns for the materials. So some rabbis say you're not allowed to do it. Some rabbis say you are. So there's one rabbi that says you're allowed to do it totally. You're allowed to do it because it's an indirect labor. And one rabbi says this is Rabbi Yossi. So Rabbi Yossi says you're allowed to do it to save all sorts of materials. I mean, you can look at it in the Steinsaltz. Right. On Shabbat, because he sought to spare the lamp, the oil, or the wick, he is liable. Rabbi Yossi exempts in all cases. So Rabbi Yossi says you can do it if you want to spare the lamp or the oil, but not the wick. If you're just doing it to spare the wick, he says that you can't do. And then you're liable for a Shabbat violation. Okay. Without going into detail, how do you understand Rabbi Yossi? So Rabbi Yossi says you can spare the lamp itself, the heating oil, but you can't do it to spare just the wick.
It's cheap.
Yeah, he's saying that's too cheap. Because if you're relying on this, like Shabbat shouldn't cost you a huge amount of money, come on. The wick isn't worth that much. So if you're just thinking I need to save the fraction of pennies to preserve the wick, then you can't do it. Okay. But there's issues you'll see, because there's a broader issue is direct labor, indirect labor, because in fact, it could be that you're allowed to do it anyway to save something, or it could be you're not allowed to do it at all because because you're turning it on, you're extinguishing a lamp, and you're not allowed to do that for the direct motivation. The indirect motivation maybe. Okay.
You're saying it's okay if you need to say it is okay if you have to.
I'm not saying anything. I'm reading what the rabbis say. There are rabbis that say it's okay.
But then, if they're going to be that specific, then they have to say, what percent of your income has to be involved. I mean, they're so specific about everything else. Just say I could do it and maybe I could afford it, but I say, well, I'm trying to be.
So those discussions are there. We're just not there right there. But those discussions are and you can see it's a real slippery slope. And yet it still exists. I mean, the concept of Hesed Meruba, financial loss, it does exist. It exists in the sources too. I mean, on Pesach you have to get rid of all your stuff. Right. What if you're a grain merchant? I mean, that's what and you got to get rid of it all, and that's your livelihood. And what if there's a danger in selling it? Which is a workaround. Some of these workarounds are so people don't lose money. But even in the workaround, someone could come and take all your grain. So there's a point where you got to sell. You got to throw out all your alcohol, because you can't have alcohol, grain alcohol, and you've gathered this great impressive liquor cabinet full. And so those are things that the rabbis think about, and there is a possibility that Hesed Meruba. It's almost like Pikuach Nefesh, saving a life. It's a halacha category where you can violate the halacha because it's going to cost you lots of money. So here you can see the beginnings of that. All right. So Rabbi Yossi Kaman Svirale. So they want to know, what is Rabbi Yossi's system of thought here? Who does he hold by? Ika Rabbi Yehuda Svirale. So there's a rabbi. Rabbi Yehuda doesn't believe in indirect labor at all. Okay? So they start this discussion by, the distinction between indirect labor and direct labor. So if he holds by Rabbi Yehuda, so Rabbi Yehuda outlaws any kind of indirect labor. So it doesn't matter if you're turning off the lamp to save money. It doesn't matter, because the actual act itself violates Shabbat. So Rabbi Yehuda is pretty simple. And he would say the same thing about my, kid digging in the sand, or putting the tee to practice golf. If it could lead to some other labor, you're not allowed to do it. It's pretty simple. Okay. Now, if he holds by Rabbi Yehuda, afilu b'hanach nami lechayev, well, then the other stuff should also be forbidden. Right? So it doesn't make sense. The preserving the candle and preserving the oil, that should also be forbidden. Remember, he says that stuff's allowed, Rabbi Yossi. The only thing he doesn't like is if you're only doing it to preserve the wick. But if he follows by Rabbi Yehuda, who outlaws all labor, direct or indirect, then he should outlaw the whole thing, even the other stuff, not just the wick. The Ika Rabbi Shimon Sevirale, but Rabbi Yehuda allows indirect labor. And if you allow indirect labor, ptila nami liftar. If you allow indirect labor, then you should be allowed to if your thought is to save the wick, then that should be allowed also. So we're trying to figure out, what does he think about indirect labor? Okay, because that actually is the beginning of the discussion. Yes.
Ron, I'm thinking about the systems that people have now for Shabbat timers.
Yeah.
They put all the lights on timers, so it's timers. The lamps
Yeah.
really are going
Right.
off and are coming on actually.
Right.
How do they?
Well, that's not indirect labor. That's actually the labor's done before Shabbat. And by the way, that actually in some ways reinforces the distinction, because why do they want those lights off? Maybe it's partly to save electricity. It is. I mean, there's right, but it starts with because you want it to be dark at night.
Yeah.
Right.
Right, that's the main ring, is you want it to be dark at night,
Right.
So that's why you turn on lights so it can be light, you turn them off so it can be dark. So you have timers do it for you, but in that sense you've actually done the labor before Shabbat, and then the machine is just doing it. At least that's how they interpret it. Okay. By the way, they have that. It's interesting. They actually have that in the Talmud, in ancient sources, where you could start a process. It's like irrigation. There's certain things that you could start a process before Shabbat that you know is going to continue during Shabbat, and that's okay. There's also like the slow cooking, making cholent, right? Yeah. And they had that technology,
right?
In ancient times also, right? Okay, all right. Olam ki Rabbi Yehuda. No, he says he always holds like Rabbi Yehuda, who doesn't allow indirect labor. And v'kasa bar Rabbi Yossi, and this is what he thinks. And this is interesting. Soter al manat livnot bimkomo have soter. If somebody knocks down a building with the intention to rebuild in the same place, so that's a renovation.
Right.
Okay, it's a form of sort of indirect building. That's called soter. That's called knocking something down, and that's forbidden on Shabbat. So let's say you got a building, an outhouse. Let's say in your backyard, and you eventually you have the plan of getting rid of it and building a much nicer one. And you want to do it on Shabbat, and you're just kind of walking by and you knock it over. Okay, well, what have you done? I mean, you haven't built anything. I just knocked down the stones. Okay, so this guy says this is where you get into the psychology of the person doing it. If you did it with the intent to rebuild it, well, that's work, and you can't do it. However, what if you're just kind of what if you're doing it for fun?
Or you're malicious and destructive.
Yeah, right. Or it's a kid and he's knocking down blocks, or there's all sorts of other reasons. Maybe you're doing it not to rebuild. Okay, so it says alma not leave note shalobim komo. But if you have an idea, you're going to rebuild that outhouse, but not at that exact spot. That's lo have soter. Then it's not called soter, which is knocking something down. It's just like you said, it's just destructive behavior, for fun.
Which is okay. Destructive behavior is okay.
Well, fun is okay.
Yeah.
Fun is okay. I mean, can kids play with blocks on Shabbat, or you're walking in your backyard and you're knocking things down? I mean, Shabbat doesn't prohibit all activity. It prohibits work. So this is part of the definition of what's work. So if you're knocking it down and you don't intend to build right there, so you're not doing it as an act of renovation. Now, by the way, it's tricky because eventually if you're going to build a new outhouse, a couple blocks down, eventually you're going to get rid of the one. Right. So you are sort of doing some work. But they're saying if you're not going to rebuild that outhouse and you're just kind of doing it as an act of play, okay, then you can knock it down. So saying that so putting out a candle on Shabbat, this is what he says. Just put it because you're afraid for the wick. You're not going to rebuild that wick. So that's what it's because you're not going to light it on Shabbat. You can't light it on Shabbat. So he says that's what it's like. That's why he allows it, because it's like knocking down a building that you're not intending to build again. Okay, I mean, if this makes sense to you, then there's something wrong with you, right? It's right. The logic doesn't really hold, yeah. But they're trying to understand why you'd allow it. All right, and remember the Talmud always starts with I say relatively weak reasons to build up to, better reasons. Now, they don't always build up to the best reasons, but in the meantime, we sort of have this little discussion about what constitutes work, which, by the way, is an interesting discussion. Yeah. Does anybody know? I mean, I think many of you do. What the model is for the Talmud, for work that's prohibited on Shabbat. Yes, so it's the work that was done in building the. All right, so in building the temple, they had to sometimes knock things down in order to rebuild, and so that's soter. Soter means to knock things down. So that's a category of labor, and they had to light lamps and extinguish them. Okay, so turn the page. Amarle Rabba. So Rabba says to him, it's our previous argument. And now you have the word mikdi. Mikdi means something, it's introducing a contrary argument. And so what's missing in this is, if ever a rabbi says mikdi, what's implied is, what you just said is stupid. I mean, maybe more politely, but it's mikdi means, hey. Come on, let's do it. Right, that doesn't make any sense because of the following. So this is his statement, mikdi. Kol melachot yalpinan lehu mishkan. So all of the categories of labor on Shabbat are derived from building the temple in the desert. Okay. V'hatam soter almanat livnot shelo bimkomohu. There was it. Okay. Right. And there, every time they knocked down a building, you weren't going to build it in the same. They weren't going to build it there. It was always going to be to build it somewhere else, and yet it's prohibited. Right, yet it's prohibited. So don't come to me saying that knocking down a building in order to build it somewhere else is allowed, because that's all. Remember, that's all they did with the temple in the desert, because they would go from place to place. Right. So when they were knocking it down, that was clearly work, because they knew they were going to rebuild it someplace else. And every manner of labor, every category of labor that they did in putting together and then moving the tabernacle in the desert is not allowed. So this whole category that you're introducing of knocking something down in order to build it somewhere else, and that would be allowed, it can't be allowed, because that's all they did. The entirety of the act of soter, of knocking things down in the desert, was always building it someplace else, because they never stayed in one place. By the way, it's not quite true, right? I mean, they did stay in some place sometimes, but very often they would move, and that was part of their labor, was to knock it down.
So I guess we're talking about pre-temple days.
We're talking about the Israelites in the desert, and the tabernacle that they built in the desert. Yeah. And of course, the rabbis aren't writing them; they're using that as a model for what would be prohibited on Shabbat. And the Torah says don't work. So that's you're going to have lots of definitions of what that means. So they use that as their paradigm for work, the labor that was used in building the tabernacle in the desert, including the labor that we see that was involved in moving it from place to place, which is why carrying, for instance, on Shabbat, which doesn't seem like labor, but carrying on Shabbat is not allowed unless you have an Eruv. It's allowed indoors. Okay. Amar le shane hatam. So he answers back to him and says, well, that's different. Okay. That actually what happened in the tabernacle is different. Kevan dechtiv al pi Adonai yechanu, because it says God told them where to go. So they knew that God was going to get them on the move all the time. So actually there, in the case in the desert, when they would knock down the building in order to rebuild it, and then they would build it later, at some place that God would tell them to go, there it was as if they were still in the same place. Because they knew, yeah, right. Also because they knew that's what they were supposed to do, was wander. Now that actually is a good argument. Now that we live in one place, and we live we're not getting up and moving every day. That's not our normal life. So their normal life was getting up and moving every day like nomads. So knocking things down and building them in a different place, that would be their normal life. For us, that would be knocking stuff down and then building it in the same place. So therefore, we're allowed to invent this category of knocking something down, and then for the purpose of building it someplace else. But if it's to rebuild it, to renovate in your own backyard, you're not allowed to do it.
So let me ask then,
I knew you wouldn't like this stuff.
I love it.
Yeah, I know. I knew you'd have objections to it too. So,
Let's say you've built the tabernacle next to a river, and on Friday, and it's swelling from a storm upstream.
Yeah.
And it's obviously going to wipe away the tabernacle if you don't move it on Saturday. What happens?
Oh, well, that's we talked earlier about if there's going to be a big financial loss, a really big financial loss, then yes, you go and you.
It's like saving your life on Shabbat.
Right. Also, there weren't a lot of rivers in the desert, as far as I know.
I was thinking that might not be.
What I was thinking you're going to say is, what if you let the river do your work for you? You put it in the river. You know sort of the currents of the river, so you know where it's going to go.
Well, that's like starting cooking the day before.
Well, that's like a timer. Yeah, it's like a timer also. So theoretically, I suppose I'm not sure I would advise that from a practical basis because you don't know where where the river is. Right. It's a little, yeah. But yeah. All right. And then it says kisoter almanat leave note bim komodame. So what they did to knock something down, knowing it would be built someplace else. For us, that would be like knocking something down and building it in the same place, which would not be allowed. Okay. Rabbi Yochanan said, "Le'olam kirami Shimon." I says no. So Rabbi Yossi, who says you can extinguish the lamp if you're worried about the wick, just the wick alone. So he says that. No, he's actually right, like Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon, who allows all indirect work. Okay, so his system follows Rabbi Shimon, Sfira Le, Umay Shnap Tila. Okay, so why the wick? Because so if he allows indirect work, he should allow you to extinguish the candle no matter what, as long as you're doing it to save money on the candle, on the lamp itself, and not just to make it dark. So why would he not allow you to, if you're thinking about the wick? Here's why. Kidamar Rav Humamnuna, Ve'itema Rav Hada, because it says Rav Hamnuna said, in the name of Rav Ada Bar Ahava, Rav Ada, the son of Ahava, Ahava meaning love. It's a nice name, right? Hacha b'ptila shetzarich lehavhavha askinan. All right, so we're going to get into some medieval or late antiquity crafts that there are wicks that actually benefit from being extinguished. Don't ask me to explain it because I haven't made a wick. But this is what they're claiming is that there are wicks
it's like the
that
birthday candle that you keep lighting and you can blow it out and then it lights up again.
So if you extinguish it, you're actually improving the wick. Almost like you're building the wick, like you're repairing the wick, making it stronger.
Is that good or bad?
And that's bad on Shabbat. That's not something you would do on Shabbat. Right, so that's what, if you're thinking about the wick, it's actually the act of putting it out because you're concerned about the wick. You've already admitted that. I'm doing this because I'm a cheapskate and I want to save the cents in putting out the wick. But so in addition to that, which would be okay because it's indirect labor. But what you're doing in putting it out, and you said you're concerned about the wick, is you're making a better wick. You're improving the wick. Okay. Rabbi Shimon modeh the kan mitaken mana. As Rabbi Shimon says, you're admitting that actually you're building a wick, you're improving the wick, you're repairing the wick, and that's clearly not allowed. Amar Rava, dika nami de katane, and Rava says, yes, that's right, as it's written, shehu osepacham, that you're making it like a coal, and a piece of coal is easier to light on fire, so you made a better wick. Velo katane b'bnei shana set pacham. And it's not as if it becomes one by its own. So your action of putting it out is an action that actually makes it a better wick. Shma mina. So we learned from that, you're not allowed to do it. Okay. And that's the end of that discussion. Okay.
How law school started.
What?
This is how law school started with this guy.
That's a big insult.
I'm trying to see where it's intuitive, but it's...
Well, the interesting distinction between direct work and indirect work, I've always found that interesting. It's troubling, but you see the beginnings of workarounds that you have. Right. For instance, last night in our class we talked about non-Jews that do labor for you, which clearly go against the spirit of Shabbat. It's a workaround, but it was a way for Jews to really, still develop sophisticated societies while at the same time resting on Shabbat. And timers are an example of that also.
I guess it's equivalent to the the non-Jew, and you walk by and say, "Wouldn't it be nice if the lights were out?"
Right.
Yeah. I will
Without
say so.
saying,
I mean,
"Please turn the light."
in defense of the system, people that observe Shabbat seriously still have a very, very different life on Shabbat than the rest of the week.
Yeah.
It's a very different life. So even with all the workarounds, you have all the timers, you have the Shabbos Goy, you've got everything, it's still a very different life. It's still a very restful life. There's still a strong sacred dimension to it. So let's not make too much fun of these things because they allow you to have a more comfortable existence, to eat hot food, for it to be light and dark, to sleep. At the same time, it's not as if they've destroyed Shabbat with these innovations. They haven't. I mean, it's a very strong difference between someone who observes Shabbat and doesn't observe Shabbat in their life on Saturdays, even with all the halachic innovations.
And one of the other things that I think is really special is the focus is on the family because you're all together. Everybody isn't running off doing their own things.
Right.
So that's another part of
Right.
that kind of
Might
Shabbat.
the electric vehicles on a Shabbat be a workaround? You plug them
Especially
in,
if you start them the day
you
before.
plug them in before and then you drive them on Shabbat.
Or actually, what you could say is,
Yeah, I can't unplug them on
and
Shabbat.
this isn't a class in Jewish law, so I don't want to get too deeply into this. But what if you were to be able to program it beforehand? And we're certainly, yeah, right. So our technology is very close to that. Like you program it beforehand to drive to some place,
Yeah.
and then so all you're really doing is getting into this room,
Right.
which is your,
Yeah.
and then it goes by itself,
by itself,
and you've
yeah.
done the work. So that's interesting. So the only what I'll answer is that the only prohibition, the only possible prohibition there is you're not allowed to travel too far on Shabbat.
Okay, but if you're too far from your shul, and
No,
you want to go to shul-
there's measurements for what's too
yeah,
far.
so if you
it's
want
the
to
next
go to
city.
shul,
Yeah.
which was
Yeah.
hopefully to elevate
Yeah.
you spiritually,
Right.
and you have access to a vehicle which is not creating fire, it's not working, it's pre-programmed
No, for sure.
long before Shabbat,
No, for sure.
you can drive.
Yeah,
So that's where the
that
workarounds come from eventually with
Right.
modern technology, right?
Right. I mean, because you have ancient examples of that too. You get on a boat. And the boat starts before Shabbat, and clearly you're allowed to travel on a boat. There were weeks of, but the boat's going.
How does that work?
And you actually pay for you've paid a ticket. Right. So, but you pay the ticket before Shabbat, and then you're just there, and it's just going. And it's like a timer too. You've done the work before Shabbat, and then there's a process that starts. That's in the Talmud. That's not a modern worker. I mean, that's in the Talmud. The idea's there, and you could just see it's an extension of those ideas. Yeah.
How specific is the Torah on work?
Not very specific at all.
So this is all.
It's not very specific at all. 6
is interpreted.
Right, 6 days you shall work, Shabbat. You can't. Very, very few specifics.
That's the reason you got discussions like
Yeah.
This whole idea you said about unless there's a large financial loss, is that because it could end up in family tragedy, or I mean, if you don't have money, it can't.
I don't know. I guess so. Yeah. I guess that's, ultimately it could lead to some loss of life. It's just a category. Hesed Meruba. The word Hesed means loss. Meruba means great. So that's, of course, that's also subjective. Yeah. What's a great loss? And I don't know they have income statements in discussing this. I think, what I think is you ask a rabbi. I don't think it's like filling out forms and you ask a rabbi and the rabbi says yes or no. It's a judgment call, yeah.
How might the rabbis of old have treated what we now call recreation within their roof? You have a tennis court.
Oh, yeah. Well, they had recreation. A lot of the discussion about indirect labor, my golf example is not totally out of thin air. I mean, a lot of the examples come from recreation.
And it seems
even walking with certain kinds of shoes can create,
Rust.
Right. So if remember largely agricultural societies, and you could create, divots for planting and so yeah. Or you got a dog, and the dog walks around and creates these holes, and you use them. Can you use them afterwards on Shabbat? And then it gets complicated. Your dog is going to do those things, so you begin to count on it. But the point isn't to necessarily, or I don't know. It's hard to judge at some point.
This is just a hypothesis, but it just seems like in ancient times, before there was a Saturday, a Shabbos, people worked all the time.
Yeah.
It was a wonderful thing that a group of people decided one day out of 7 we're not going to work.
Right,
we're going to rest. And then you start putting all these rules on it, and you turn it into something no better than what you had before you started.
Well, that's why I say it is better than what you had before you started. There's still, even with all the workarounds, there's this very, you could see anybody would be able to tell the difference between a Shabbat observance home and a not Shabbat observant home. The feel would be very different. Even with, like I said, the Shabbos Goy and the clock and all the workarounds, and it would still be, there's still
a celebration.
Yeah. A celebration, you have to bring some emotion to it. But I'm just saying that the very, the feel of the life would seem very different. There's a lot of things they're not doing. Look, you wouldn't have television, you wouldn't have radio, you wouldn't have somebody working on their computer. You wouldn't be traveling.
You have social interaction.
Yeah, that's what it is.
That's right. Yeah. That's exactly right.
Yeah.
All right, I'm actually going to read the Mishnah just to disturb you even more. Actually, I mean that somewhat as a joke, but it's a very disturbing Mishnah. It's very, very disturbing. And then we're going to spend next several weeks discussing it. And, it's my policy is not to skip things just because I don't like them or they represent ideologies that maybe we don't accept as moderns, but we're going to read it anyway. And at least I'll start it, and then we'll probably continue next week. So this is the Mishnah. Ashalosh averot nashim metot bishat ledatan. So there's 3 sins for which women die in childbirth. Some of you may have heard this. Al she'enan zeirot benida. They're not careful in the laws of menstruation. The various family purity laws. 1. Bichala. The law of challah. Anybody know what that is?
You're supposed to separate a little piece of
when you bake challah, you have to take a little bit and burn it up.
Right.
Yeah, and it's reminiscent of the first fruits, and a whole series of legislation in the Torah where you give the first of what you create to God. Okay, so you give a little bit of the challah and you burn it up as a kind of sacrifice. Uva hadlakat ner. And and lighting Shabbat candles too. So women that don't perform these things well or don't perform them at all, the penalty for that is to die in childbirth. Okay. Who's heard this before? Yeah. So some of you heard it before, right? Yeah. Okay. So it's a troubling Mishnah, and we'll spend the next couple of weeks.
Is somebody putting the woman to death?
No, they're not saying that. So it's not saying that. The penalty is not death. It's explaining why they die on childbirth. Right.
One could imagine if there was a woman in this panel that this wouldn't have happened.
There's no medical malpractice.
What wouldn't have happened? The statement wouldn't have appeared?
Yeah, one could have, because this is all men doing this.
Yeah. Women still would have died in childbirth. They're sort of.
But this statement this